When Donald Trump talks about the United States needing Greenland, it sounds like another provocation. Harsh words, pressure, threats. If you view it objectively, you'll see this isn't really about Trump. It's a story about a map. That doesn't change with elections or the White House's mood. Everyone frames it today as a question of sovereignty and diplomacy, but behind it, there's a much harsher logic. The shortest route for strategic weapons goes through the Arctic. New sea routes are opening up there, and under the ice are resources that are essential in the 21st century. Technological superiority cannot be maintained without them. When Russian and Chinese activity increases in this area, Washington responds. Not to shock the world, but because the security balance is shifting. Now pay attention. The biggest turning point is that Greenland can no longer be seen as a distant piece of ice that's occasionally discussed in the media. Today, it's one of the few points on the map from which you can simultaneously monitor the Arctic, control new maritime routes, and influence the security balance between the United States, Russia, and China. When these factors combine, it shifts from being a symbol to hard geopolitics. That's why everything is different now. Not because Donald Trump has changed, but because the world in which decisions about Greenland are made has changed. The form of American pressure may be unacceptable to many. The reasons why Greenland is suddenly at the center of attention are much older and much more serious than they might seem at first glance. You're watching Beyond Borders. Let's begin. Is it just Trump trying to provoke? These days, most people know what Trump and Greenland refer to. They see it as another one of his outbursts, a deliberately exaggerated statement meant to shock, dominate the media space, and push partners onto the defensive. In this scenario, Greenland is just a backdrop, something that fits into headlines but in reality has no chance of happening. That's how it's most often talked about. And that's exactly how it's talked about comfortably. But this perspective has one fundamental weakness. It assumes that this is an isolated idea of a single politician, an improvisation that shouldn't be taken seriously. But the moment such statements are repeated, when they are followed by concrete actions, and when people around the president start adopting them, it stops being just a rhetorical trick. It starts to become a signal. Trump's style distorts this signal. It's loud, confrontational, and often needlessly offensive. That's exactly why it's very easy for the form to completely overshadow the content. Europe focuses on tone, the media analyze words, but what's really important is being missed. The United States is now talking about Greenland differently, not as an allied territory, but as an area that's too important to be left outside of direct control. This mistake is understandable. The West is used to reading Trump as an anomaly, as a temporary malfunction, not a system symptom. But with Greenland, this isn't just a publicity stunt. It's a long game involving maps, security, and time. And if we focus only on provocative statements, we can very easily overlook the fact that the very logic of American thinking in the Arctic isn't changing for the first time. It's just being said out loud for the first time. And this is where the whole story starts to shift, not with the question of whether Trump is unpredictable, but with the question of whether the United States would think about Greenland differently if someone with a more polished demeanor were sitting in the White House. And the answer to that question isn't as comfortable as many would like. America needs Greenland. Looking at the map without emotion or politics, it becomes clear why the United States is more interested in Greenland than most of the world. It's not off to the side. It's located exactly where North America, Europe, and the Arctic meet. The shortest air routes between the great powers pass through this area. The trajectories of strategic weapons pass through there, and it's right here that it's decided who has control over what's happening in the north of the planet. During the Cold War, Greenland was a key point for early warning. Today, its importance is returning, but in a broader sense. The Arctic is no longer a frozen frontier. The melting ice is opening new sea routes, shortening trade distances, and changing logistics between Asia, Europe, and America. What was theoretical just a few decades ago is now becoming practical planning. No major power wants to be blind in this area. China and Russia are stepping in, not symbolically but systematically. Research missions, military exercises, infrastructure, the presence of ships and aircraft. Each step can be justified on its own. Together, however, they create a picture in which the Arctic ceases to be a neutral zone and begins to be a space of competition. And for the United States, Greenland is the only place from which this area can be monitored, controlled, and, if necessary, protected. The United States' effort to acquire Greenland is not new at all. Washington has been trying for more than 150 years, and at various times has come up with concrete offers that Denmark has repeatedly rejected. What is changing today is not the basic motivation, but its urgency. The world has accelerated, technology has progressed, and the Arctic is now open in ways that can't be ignored. Washington doesn't see this as expansion just for its own sake. If the United States loses oversight and influence in the Arctic, it will lose control in a region that will shape security, trade, and technology in the coming decades. And that's exactly why Greenland stopped being seen as a distant territory of an ally and started being viewed as a weak spot that requires a solution. This explains why Greenland is being discussed so intensely again, not as a random outburst of a single president, but as a reaction to a world that is changing faster than old agreements are able to absorb. And this is exactly where the conflict begins between what is strategically understandable and what is politically and diplomatically acceptable. Why right now? If it were only about geography, the pressure on Greenland would differ. Maps stay the same, but the pace and competition have changed. The world has moved into a phase where the great powers have stopped waiting and started acting before the rules are definitively established. The Arctic is exactly such a space today. It hasn't been divided yet, but it's already important enough that no one can afford to ignore it. The key factor is China. Although it is not located in the Arctic, it behaves like an Arctic power, investing in research, pushing for access to resources, showing interest in infrastructure, and has long been talking about the so-called Polar Silk Road. For Washington, this concern is real. China could slowly secure resources and routes vital for energy, technology, and global trade. Greenland is one of the last places where this process remains influenceable. Russia is taking a different route but has the same goal. It views the Arctic as its cultural and strategic sphere, building military capacities, restoring bases, testing new systems, and controlling the northern sea route. For Moskva, it's leverage. For the United States, a warning. If the North became a place where others took the initiative, the United States' response would be delayed. Climate change enters this picture, not as a political issue, but as a physical reality. The ice is retreating, seasons are lengthening, and areas once accessible for weeks are now open for months. New routes shorten the distances between Asia and Europe, change the economics of transportation, and increase the importance of points that were previously peripheral. In this environment, Greenland no longer feels like the end of the world, but becomes a hub, which is why pressure has intensified now. Not because the United States suddenly realized the value of Greenland, but because new players have emerged who are willing to act faster and more aggressively. In this world, caution is weakness and hesitation is risky. That's when strategy clashes with diplomacy. That's why Trump doesn't act when things are calm. He acts when opportunities shrink. And the more it narrows, the less room there is for subtle solutions. This is where it starts to explain why the form of American pressure is so problematic. And it also comes from the sense that time no longer benefits the West, Denmark and Greenland, the weak spot of the West. In this debate, people often talk about the United States, Russia, and China, but much less is said about why Greenland ended up in a position where others are deciding its future. The key is not just its location, but also the political and economic reality it finds itself in. Greenland is autonomous, but not fully sovereign. And it is precisely this ambiguity that makes it a sensitive point in a system otherwise built on clear boundaries. Denmark is formally responsible for the defense and foreign policy of Greenland. In reality, this country has long underestimated the Arctic. The military presence was minimal, the infrastructure was weak, and strategic planning was mostly symbolic. This was not the result of bad intentions, but rather the belief that the North would remain stable and outside the big game. However, this assumption fell apart faster than the institutions could adapt. Greenland itself is in an even more complicated situation. It has a strong identity and seeks more independence, yet still relies economically on subsidies from Copenhagen. An island the size of a continent, with no roads between cities, a small population, and a limited economy, doesn't have much room to maneuver. Every discussion about the future automatically runs into the question of who will pay for the functioning of the state, infrastructure, and security. This is where the tension appears, which outwardly seems like an opportunity. If Greenland wants more self-determination, it needs partners, capital, and security guarantees. And if Denmark can't offer all of that sufficiently, the space opens up for someone else, not in the form of pressure, but as an offer. Not as a conflict, but as a solution to a problem. From the West's perspective, it's an unpleasant combination. Weak defense, political ambiguity, and economic dependence create a situation where strategic decisions can be bypassed without breaking the rules. Formally, everything is in order. However, this creates a space where the balance of power can shift without any treaties or violence. That's why Greenland is more than a geographical issue. It's a reflection of how unprepared the West was for tougher geopolitics. Not because it lacked strength, but because it assumed it wouldn't have to use it or plan systematically. That assumption is no longer valid today, and the whole story about Greenland is beginning to unfold in its cracks. Where Trump is fundamentally mistaken. From the current perspective, it may seem that the pressure of the United States on Greenland is strategically understandable. However, the problem is not the goal, but the way it is talked about and the way it is being pushed. Trump's approach turns a security issue into a political confrontation. Instead of reducing uncertainty, he multiplies it. And by doing so, he complicates exactly what the United States would need to achieve peacefully. When strategic interests are communicated through coercion, threats, or public disparagement of partners, resistance is automatically created, not just in Copenhagen but also in Greenland. An issue that could have been handled quietly and technically over time is now becoming a symbol of the fight for sovereignty. In this environment, rational arguments matter less, while emotions, identity, and political pride become important. This approach paradoxically weakens Trump's own position. Every statement about the need for Greenland in a sharp tone strengthens those who warn against American interference and weakens those who would be open to pragmatic cooperation. Polarization is replacing gradual rapprochement. Instead of trust, suspicion is growing, and that's exactly what makes any solution more fragile. From a geopolitical point of view, it's inefficient. The United States has enough tools to secure its influence in the Arctic without causing a crisis, economically, politically, and in terms of security. However, public pressure and forceful statements are narrowing this space. Thus, opening a base or using force would signal a diplomatic failure, not strategic necessity. And if you're interested in how such scenarios might look in practice, I discuss them in more detail in a separate video dedicated to the possible paths the situation could take. Conclusion: why is everything truly different? Greenland's story is now often reduced to one politician and their statements. But in reality, it's about something much bigger that's happening to the world around it. The map stays the same, but places we've long seen as marginal are becoming more significant. And Greenland is one of them. Today we're seeing power dynamics return to an area once thought to be automatically stable. The Arctic is opening up, great powers are shifting, and the rules the West was used to are no longer enough. In this environment, no one is interested. Strategic decisions are not made because someone wants to make them, but because they have to be made. Greenland is not the goal itself in this story. It's a test. It's a test of how alliances work under pressure, how decisions are made between rules and the reality of power, and how quickly the system can adapt to a world that's changing faster than its institutions. And that's exactly why everything is different. Not because Donald Trump has changed, but because the context in which decisions about security, sovereignty, and power are made has changed. And if we don't understand this shift, we'll perceive even the most serious signals as mere noise until reality catches up with us.
If you liked the video, I'd appreciate a like, and be sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next ones I'm working on. You can support my work through a thank you. And if you want to help the video reach more people, click on praise. I appreciate it.